Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, December 1st. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by Edward Cameron, who's an area resident and an environmental and climate advocate and consultant who works with a variety of organizations and institutions who shape and design strategies for achieving a low-carbon, climate-resilient, and inclusive global economy. Ed, great to have you back in the program again.
Always lovely to be with you, Andrew. Thank you.
I just thought to get us started, I suppose the obvious place is to have you comment or give us your assessment of the recent Cop26 climate summit that took place in Glasgow, Scotland recently. I know you've been to several of these summits over the years. I guess what was your takeaway from it? There seemed like there was a lot more expectation or maybe hope or concern, I'm not sure what the right word is exactly, that with growing evidence that climate change is not only a problem that's 10 or so years away, but is kind of right here, right now, and we're seeing increasing evidence of that, that the necessity for some kind of tangible action was a little bit more present than it might have been at some of the earlier ones. But let me stop there and have you tell us what you thought the successes or lack of successes were coming out of the conference.
Well, I think the sensation you were feeling was urgency. And you mentioned that I've attended many of these COPs before. My first engagement with COP was back in the period of the Kyoto Protocol in the late 1990s. And at that particular moment, the global community needed to reduce greenhouse gases by between 7 and 9% over a 15-year period. Fast forward 24 years, and we now need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% over a 9-year period. So the sensation is one of urgency because we have delayed and denied for so long. And as a consequence, the steps we now need to take over the coming years are that much more difficult. So essentially what happened in Glasgow is two tracks. On the first track, you have 196 countries from all over the world meeting to iron out a diplomatic text to reach consensus amongst these countries as to what they will do to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. That means what they will do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what they will do to build resilience into our societies in the face of current climate impacts, how they will mobilize finance in order to transition to a new climate economy, and how they will facilitate what's called a just transition, making sure that the new economy we build is one of shared prosperity rather than extraction. So that's the diplomatic part of the conversation in Glasgow. The other track is essentially the largest climate trade fair in the world, where companies, civil society, academia, the full spectrum of stakeholders from our society come together to try and iron out solutions for the climate crisis. So typically a COP will gather together anywhere up to 20,000 people from across the world, from across different stakeholder groups. I would say that the fundamental takeaway from Glasgow is that they have managed to keep alive the idea of reducing emissions consistent with avoiding dangerous climate change, but only barely. The negotiations themselves were fraught. There were all manner of difficulties around finance and how we move money away from high carbon towards low carbon. There was a lot of resistance to putting in place the types of mechanisms that will truly decarbonize our economy over the coming decade. But there was also, I think, a tipping point in terms of what I would call the spirit of the negotiations. I think we're coming out of a decade that I've called the era of announcements, where people get a lot of credit for giving press releases that say we will decarbonize by mid-century, but then don't really feel any sense of accountability for honoring those promises. And I think that era of announcements is now sunsetting, and what people are demanding is an era of accountability. They don't want to see promises anymore, they want to see tangible plans. And I think both governments and companies are now going to come under increasing pressure on the outside of Glasgow to actually deliver on promises they've been making. So I would say that overall, my sense is that they have just done enough to keep the show on the road. But I think the expectation when they meet again next year in Egypt is going to be even greater.
Why is it so hard for governments to to match words with actions? Tangible.
Well, let me start that answer by explaining the reasons why it's not hard. It's not hard because we already have the solutions we need to create a low carbon, resilient and inclusive world. Solutions related to energy, transportation, land use. It's not hard because of a lack of finance, because we have enough finance in the global economy to transition. The reason why it is actually hard is a reason of politics. And I'll give you a very tangible example. I mentioned earlier that I started working on climate in the era of the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol was undermined, at least in the United States, as a consequence of something called the Byrd-Hagel Resolution, which was sponsored by Senator Byrd of West Virginia back in 1997. Fast forward to 2021, and President Biden's Build Back Better bill, which also features provisions around decarbonization of energy, transport, and land use, is being undermined by the senator from West Virginia. In this occasion, it's Senator, of course, Joe Manchin. And the fundamental reason for that is because West Virginia is heavily dependent on coal. And if you look around the world, if you look at India, for example, anywhere up to 15 to 20 million people in India are dependent on coal for their livelihoods. The revenue of entire states and provinces in India, and therefore the money that these provinces invest in healthcare and infrastructure and education, comes from coal. So right around the world, high carbon sectors, whether it's big agriculture, coal, oil, gas, all of those generate livelihoods, they generate revenue for governments and companies. They therefore create a class of vested interests in the current high carbon economy. And as a consequence, persuading those vested interests to move away from that resource towards a low carbon future is extremely difficult politically. And that's something that we have to grapple with. One of the things I've been saying since Glasgow is that we will not have a transition unless we have a just transition. And what I mean by that is, if we neglect and forget the people in Appalachia, the people around the world dependent on coal, the people around the world dependent on oil for their very livelihoods, if we do not invite those people into a shared prosperity as we go about the process of decarbonization, then we will fail, because we cannot afford to leave those people behind morally, but we cannot afford to leave them behind politically. Whether we like it or not, in the United States right now, the transition to a low carbon future is dependent on the goodwill and the votes of people who live in states that are high carbon. And we're going to have to win those people over if we're going to make this transition. So it's not about the technology, it's not about the finance, it's very much about the politics.
Recently, you gave what I thought was an extremely interesting talk as part of the GMAL series of conversations on climate change. I believe it was up at Long Trail School. And that's also available on GNAT. So if anybody's watching this and hasn't had a chance to watch your talk there, this is a great little suggestion that would be a good use of their time. But one of the things I thought was one of the most interesting points that you made, just to follow up on what you were just saying there, is your ideas on how to break through to climate skeptics and people, let's say, who live in states like West Virginia, where there's been a cultural and economic connection to the coal industry for, a very long time, over 100 years or more. What is the formula, or what is the approach that is needed to talk to folks who live there and have a very close connection to coal or other fossil fuel industries, to make them feel okay about saying, well, all right, that era is over. Now we need to look at other forms of renewable energy?
My sense from the work that I've done over 25 years is that most people, whether as individuals or as part of a collective, part of a government, part of a company, are motivated by risk and reward. So what we've got to do is we've got to make arguments that emphasize the risks of inaction on climate change, not at a global level, but at a very granular level. What does it mean for you and your family? What does it mean for your community? So we have to talk about risk, but we also have to talk about reward. How will you benefit from the new climate economy? What will it mean for your wages? What will it mean in terms of opportunities for your family, for your children going forward? And those risks and rewards are specific depending on who you are and where you live and what type of company you are, for example. We must also learn that people are motivated by different things. One of the failures of the environmental community, I think, is that we've become accustomed to talking about our own interests and motivations and excitement, as opposed to appealing to our audience. So what I always try to do is to change the nature of my language depending on the audience I'm speaking with. If I'm speaking to a faith-based audience, I will talk about faith and human rights and the Bible and what the Bible has to say about stewardship of creation. If I'm talking to a national security audience, I will talk about the deployment of US service personnel overseas in fragile states that are becoming ever more unstable as a consequence of climate impacts. If I'm talking to a corporate audience, I will talk about enterprise risk management. I will talk about the financial rewards of the new economy. So I think we've got to change our vocabulary of arguments in order to appeal to our audiences. We've also got to understand, I think, that there is segmentation within the people we're trying to appeal to. Yes, there are people out there who are misleading, and they're doing that deliberately because they are invested in a high carbon future. But there are also people out there who are uninformed, and there are people out there who are misinformed. And we've got to do a better job of bringing information to them. We've got to do a better job of meeting them where they are and not treating them as people who are ignorant, not treating them as people who are foolish because they're behind the curve on this issue, but understanding that there are many legitimate reasons for why people have not yet bought into this transition. Sometimes they've not bought into this transition because they feel that it's too expensive to solarize their home or to switch to an electric vehicle. And we need to meet them where they are and help them to understand the risks of inaction and the benefits of action. One of the things I'd say, just to conclude this point, is I've spent time in West Virginia. And the issue in West Virginia is not just about finances. It's not just about the fact that coal gives you a job. It's actually an issue of cultural identity. It's an issue of masculinity for most people who work in coal. This resource gives me the chance to feed my kids, and that's what makes me a man. And so they don't only see the movement away from coal as something that's threatening to their pocketbook. They see it as something that's threatening to their very identity. And we have to understand that, and we have to meet them where they are on that issue. And I think too often, because of the polarized politics in our country, it actually becomes a shouting match as opposed to a conversation. So maybe we need to help people simmer down a little bit and to have genuine conversations with people where we treat them with respect as opposed to simply broadcasting at them. I think for too long, the environment community has frankly been led by people who are white and middle class and prosperous, and who often cannot understand that there is resistance to climate leadership precisely because of these pocketbook and cultural issues. And that's why, for example, one of the things I've been saying lately, which builds upon a lot of literature that's out there, is that we need what's called a working class environmentalism. We can't just go on talking about EVs and solarization, because there are things that are available to people who are doing quite well in life. We've also got to think about how do we provide solutions to people who maybe aren't as prosperous, but would like to do the right thing on this issue if given the opportunity and given the support. Another thing that I would say is that too many of the leaders on this issue are people who are identified as center-left in terms of their politics. And one of the great, great urgent needs, I think, in our society right now is to have more spokespeople on this issue who come from the center-right of politics. Because more often than not, you'll be willing to believe someone who's from your own tribe. And there are too few people, I would say, in the Republican tribe in this country right now who are speaking out on this issue and are therefore trusted voices within conservative movements, within evangelical movements. That wasn't always the case, and it doesn't have to be the case going forward. So I would say one of the things that we really need to do is to find new champions who are able to speak in a new language about this issue, and therefore move some of the people, some of the neighbors that we have who haven't yet been moved.
Yeah, since we are seeing some increasing evidence between wildfires out west and hurricanes and unusual weather events like the deep freeze that struck Texas earlier this year, the sense that, this really is actually happening. What folks were telling us was going to happen 20 or so years ago is now arriving. What do we need to do to keep climate change? I guess the benchmark is 2 degrees centigrade above whatever the Earth's temperature was, let's say 200 or so years ago, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, in order to keep these extreme climate events from being a regular sort of thing. Is that the benchmark we need to be striving for, and how are we going to do that?
So the benchmark is we need to hold global mean temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And in order to do that, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% during this decade, and we must reach what's called net zero emissions by 2050. And net zero emissions means that you minimize the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, and whatever residual emissions are going into the atmosphere from land use or transport or energy are captured in various types of carbon sinks. That's forests, that's soil, that's land. So essentially, we've got to get to a point by mid-century where we've created this balance between sources and sinks. And the reason we've got to do that is because failing to do it means we do see an increase in intensity and frequency of extreme weather events like hurricanes and heat waves and wildfires. We see a change in the distribution of water with more flooding, but also more droughts in places that are susceptible to droughts. And we see a breakdown of ecosystem services, something like, for example, 25% of all marine life is dependent on coral reef systems, and coral reef irreparably bleaches beyond 2 degrees Celsius if temperature rises. So that's what we have to do. In order to do that, what we need to do is to decarbonize energy, transport, and land use. In energy, it means energy efficiency, energy productivity, consuming less energy, improving transmission of energy so that less energy is lost between the power plant and the end user. It means using more renewable energy, so shifting away from coal and oil towards solar and wind. It means improving technology around battery storage so that we can depend upon the renewable energy that we collect, for example, when the sun is shining, and be able to deploy it at night. In transportation, it means using more public transport. It means creating walkable cities and towns. It means using electric vehicles. And in land use, it means reforestation. It means also, for example, switching our diets away from meat, and particularly beef-intensive diets, more towards vegetarian diets. So we know what we have to do. We actually know how to do it. We have the finance to enable us to do it. There are enormous co-benefits to doing this, not least co-benefits related, for example, to health. The question is, do we have the political will to do it or not? The question is, do we have the imagination to do it or not? And that's where we're currently falling short, I would argue, on the courage and creativity that we need in our politics. But all of these things are absolutely doable, and there are pockets around the world who are doing this as we speak.
One of the themes that seemed to be emerging from the Cop26 summit was the responsibility of the developed world, the rich world, to assist less developed countries, less poorer countries, who ironically are more on the cusp of being directly impacted by climate change than some of the wealthier nations. I guess the argument being that, we've had 200 years to kind of, harness all these fossil fuel generating technologies. We became rich through that. We haven't, meaning the undeveloped world. It's your responsibility, rich world, to help us, do what we need to do. Now, I think there was a plan from a few years back that the wealthy nations would contribute to a fund of about $100 billion annually that would go towards helping poorer nations, buttress their resilience. But there seems to be a bit of hesitation on the part of the wealthier nations to do that. I wonder if you could unpack that for us. Is the poorer nations argument a valid one, do you think?
So I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. Let's start with this issue of responsibility. I would say that the issue here is one of inequality. And it is inequality between countries, but it's also inequality within countries. So even within the United States, climate risk is felt most acutely by marginalized and vulnerable populations. Sometimes those are populations of color. Sometimes they are populations who are low income. Sometimes they are rural populations, populations far from public services and social safeguards. So even within the United States, you see this issue of inequality amplifying risk. And you certainly see that across the world between countries as well. So undeveloped countries, as you call them, emerging markets or least developed countries, they have done the least to cause this problem because their greenhouse gas emissions are relatively low, but they're impacted first and they're impacted hardest because they are heavily dependent on natural resources. because they don't have the types of social, political, and economic prosperity that we have, for example, in Europe and North America. And consequently, there is a responsibility within industrialized countries to first and foremost lead on emissions reductions so that less of the burden for that has to be carried by developing countries, but also contribute to transferring finance to these countries so that they can decarbonize their energy system while continuing to advance energy access, so that they can decarbonize transportation systems while continuing to provide access to mobility services to their people, goods, and services, so that they can decarbonize land use while continuing to produce food for their own consumption and for export. Now, what's happened in terms of finance, I think, is one of the most glaring examples of how promises have been made, but implementation has been lacking. So in 2009, Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, made a back-of-the-envelope calculation at a COP in Copenhagen, where she said the rich world should mobilize $100 billion per year to contribute to decarbonization in developing countries. That money has never been mobilized. The amount has never been met, but even the amounts that have been mobilized have typically been provided as loans, concessional loans, loans with conditionality. In other words, we will give you some money as a loan, but the condition is you must buy stuff from us with that money. It's never been provided as grants. The money has never been led in terms of its distribution by the developing countries themselves. And that has been a major, major stumbling block in the negotiations over the last 12 years and has held us back in terms of progress elsewhere. But the bigger story is that we're focusing on the wrong amount of money, because $100 billion per year will never beat a $90 trillion global economy heading in the wrong direction. So the money promised has never been delivered, but it was also the wrong money to be focusing on. And this is an illustration of some of the traps we fall into, I would say, in climate world, that we tend to make promises and don't deliver on them, but we also tend to focus our attention on the wrong things. What we really should be focusing on is how do we fundamentally change the global economy so that it is a low carbon economy, but also how do we invite more of these emerging markets and developing countries to participate in that global economy so that they can prosper. And they're failings that we've been grappling with, I think, for many, many decades and need to overcome.
There are 2 points I'd love to hear your take on. One of them is going to be local, like what do we need to do here in Vermont? And I think coincidentally, today is the day that the Vermont Climate Commission or Council is scheduled to release a report about, should give us some kind of roadmap as to what we should be doing here within Vermont. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, what about other nations like India and China are 2 that come to mind quickly. China uses, I think, at this point, more fossil fuels than any other country, including us. And India is very dependent on, I think, as you mentioned earlier in our talk today, very dependent on coal. How do we get countries like that to kind of say, okay, well, we're gonna try and get a little bit more into a renewable energy equation than we are now?
So what I would say to that second question is, let's get our own house in order before we worry about other people's homes. And let me give you a couple of illustrations of what I mean by that. The first is, China does not need to be persuaded to act on climate change. And the reason for that is because most drinking water in China is dependent on Himalayan glacial melt. And the Chinese are fully aware that climate change is undermining those Himalayan glaciers. Second of all, most Chinese manufacturing is centered around the coast, and those coastlines are exposed to climate events like cyclones. And the third reason is the Chinese Communist Party is acutely aware of how things like respiratory disease and pollution is a major cause of undermining their own domestic legitimacy within China. Most of the riots and protests that you see taking place in China are protests related to environmental and social issues. So the Chinese government is already acting on this issue. They've already committed to decarbonization by mid-century. They've already committed to mobilizing finance at scale so that they, for example, will have 20% of all of their energy by the end of this decade coming from renewable energy. And that's the equivalent of all the electricity generated in the United States today. So China knows it has to act on this issue. But there's another reason why we need to get our own house in order first. And that is because 23% of all Chinese emissions are embedded in goods and services that are sold overseas, particularly to North America and Europe. And if you extrapolate out from that, and if you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, more than 80% of all of the oil produced in Saudi Arabia goes to 5 economies: Japan, India, China, European Union, and North America. So it's not just about our production of greenhouse gas emissions, it's about the fact that our consumption habits drive greenhouse gas emissions in other parts of the world as well. And that's why I'm saying, instead of worrying about what China and India is doing, the United States needs to worry about what it is doing in terms of its own production, but also in terms of its own consumption. I find, for example, that the conversation about the need to reduce emissions is a live conversation going on in every country around the world. Countries are moving at their own speeds. They all need to move faster, but the best thing we can do is to lead by example and not to get bogged down in what other countries are or should be doing. The question about Vermont is an interesting one. I haven't seen the draft report, of course, so I can't comment on what's going to come out in the report. My one hope is that the report does contain some degree of creativity. I'm quite worried that the report will essentially be a copy-paste of the report that was produced by the Vermont Climate Commission 5 years ago. We now have a Vermont Climate Council. We did have a Vermont Climate Commission. It produced a report with 53 recommendations. Governor Scott created the commission, but he chose not to meet with it, and he chose not to advance any of the recommendations from that report. The early press releases that I've seen, hinting at what might be in the council's recommendations, suggest that many of the recommendations will be similar. They'll be related to electrification, they'll be related to weatherization, they'll be related to electric vehicles, for example. To me, all of that is important and it's welcome, but it's not creative. And what I think creative means is not only addressing climate change as a crisis in Vermont, but understanding that the new climate economy is an opportunity for Vermont. And how are we as a state going to seize the opportunities of this new economy? I don't think we spend nearly enough time focused on that. What I think we do in this state is we go into towns that have already suffered a wealth of crises: underemployment, opioid addiction, deindustrialization, globalization, the decline in agricultural markets. And we say to those people, guess what? I've got a new crisis for you. I've got the climate crisis for you. How on earth are we going to sell people in this state on the types of measures we need to take if all we're doing is presenting them with another crisis? So I think we need a change of perspective in this state where we understand that we have much to offer in terms of creating a green economy. That offer is very appealing to companies right around the world who are relocating right now as we speak in search of places that can provide them with skilled labor, with green energy. Why aren't we going out and seizing those opportunities? Quebec to our north is doing precisely that. People in Quebec, from the government of Quebec, are going right around the United States and inviting US companies into Quebec as a consequence of having a green energy offer to make. We're not doing any of that. And I think the reason why we're not doing that is unfortunately because we simply do not have enough creativity in Montpelier right now to actually drive this agenda forward. So I look forward to the report when it comes out today. I think it's being created with the right intent. I think an awful lot of excellent thought has gone into it. I think the people who've sponsored it within the State House are very well intentioned. But what I'm really going to be looking out for is, does it have creativity and imagination? Is it less about crisis? Is it more about creating opportunities for this state?
Once again, thank you, Ed Cameron, who is an energy and environmental consultant who lives right here in our neck of the woods. And it's great to have you back on the program, Ed, as always a stimulating conversation. And also good to have all of you with us as well. Hope you found our program interesting, and well, we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, have a great day.